because we don't have standardized instruments. That's always been the big problem with double basses. You've got, you put together, 50 bass players in a room, you're going to have 50 different makes of basses and 50 different styles of strings, setups, bridges, the whole 9 yards. We're a very individual bunch, and that actually works in our favor.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today. And check out our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's been going on for the past decade and counting. I'd love to hear from you. I love hearing people's stories. Send me a message, feedback at contrabassconversations.com. Let me know a little about yourself, what you like to hear on the show. That would be great. I know you're going to dig today's episode with Bernard O'Neill. Bernard is originally from Dublin, Ireland, and he's been a bassist, arranger, and educator for over 30 years. He works regularly with artists like Sinead O'Connor and Rufus Wainwright, and he recently put out a project called Syriana, The Road to Damascus. And we'll feature an excerpt of this to start off the episode, which Bernard arranged the music for. We talk about that. And throughout the episode have some excerpts of him playing double bass also. So we dig into all sorts of topics, like how double bass has actually been in Middle Eastern music for a long time, different scales used in Arabic music and how specific the quartertones and decorations are, various bass section proclivities, miking techniques for orchestras, how Bernard got into arranging. It's an interesting story for sure. And how many talented arrangers kind of came up with Bernard in Dublin. We also dig deep into teaching and teaching improvisation in particular to more advanced string players, what Bernard's tried and what he's discovered that works. And also how Bernard structures his writing and balances it with performing, teaching, and other projects. I'd also like to give a shout out to D'Addario Strings, our sponsor, and I'd love to have you enter our latest string giveaway. D'Addario will be giving away a set of their hybrid, orchestral, and pizzicato strings. And all D'Addario strings are designed, engineered, and crafted in their New York facilities. I'd also like to thank Rob Angelotti of basscapos.com for providing hosting for the podcast. And bass capos are an excellent choice if you're looking to implement a double bass extension. Easy to install and adjust, cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches, light and quick to operate. Learn more at basscapos.com. Okay, here we go with our conversation featuring Bernard O'Neill. Yeah, it sounds like you've played with all sorts of people over the years and you do all the recording projects. And I was checking out, is Syriana, that was a fairly recent project.
That's right.
Right? Yeah, I was checking out the YouTube video of that and it looks really cool. Like, it looks like you've been involved in all sorts of world music and...
Yeah, I guess the world music thing I sort of fell into by accident.
Yeah.
And in particular, I sort of got into the Middle Eastern stuff purely being in the right place at the right time.
Okay.
So what I didn't realize when I sort of got into Middle Eastern music around 15 years ago, what I hadn't realized was that the double bass was in Middle Eastern music way back in the 30s and 40s. Huh. The singer would very often just be accompanied by violin or a rebec, maybe a qanun, a very simple tambourine called the rick, and a double bass.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
And it was very cut down, very, very much sort of chamber type stuff. And it was only sort of in the 50s and 60s that they sort of built these big Arab orchestras. But in the past, the double bass was in there. And if you look at Orchestra Babao, and a lot of the North African orchestras, they always had cellos and basses.
Oh, Okay.
From the colonial days. So they had these instruments there. So the double bass has been around a long time in world music.
Okay. Oh, that's fascinating. I was watching on that video, and it was you had some string players for the tracks there, and are they all playing in unison, or how does that work in Middle Eastern music? Is that what I was?
Well,
hearing?
a lot of their playing, those guys were a very unique orchestra based in Damascus. We went over and recorded them in Damascus, and Pan-Arab strings. They basically were working out of Damascus and Beirut. Okay. Doing all the big recordings there behind all the singers. Oh. Okay. So depending largely on the style, their big thing was they were able to fit in with all the latest type stuff with Amr Diab all the way back to Fairuz, because the guy who led the orchestra, he basically was Fairuz's musical director. So they generally will deal with unison, but it depends largely on the style of the music, whether it's unison in all the way through, or whether they decorate things, and when they do the decorations, then they put in harmonies on the decorations. Oh, okay. And the different scales, the maqam they use, and I mean, those guys were incredible to watch, because I wrote stuff out. I'd actually gone there with everything written out, all the arrangements written out. And I was told, don't print it out on computer paper, write it out by hand, because you're going to have to change stuff. Okay. So I got a friend of mine who does a lot of orchestration, got me some old-fashioned B3 size orchestral paper, the stuff that you can actually put two of them on a stand and be standing back with the bass and still be able to read them without putting your glasses on. I'm a bit of a Luddite, although I use computers for recording. When I'm arranging, I still use pencil and paper, and then I've got a fountain pen and I write it out. So I'd written everything out, and these guys are going, yeah, this is good. And then they would take their pencils and they would discuss where they were going to put the decorations, where they're going to put the quartertones, where they were going to actually change certain things. They'd write it in, and away they'd go. Wow. And they had a whole process. So the engineer who'd worked with them, they worked in this Music Box studio. It's called Music Box. I think it's probably gone now because of the war. Yeah. But they would basically go, okay, take one, buff. They'd start, they'd play, and then immediately take two, buff. And they would quadruple track everything. But they'd everything worked out. So some guys would do a descant part, other guys would keep the unison, other guys would play the viola parts. Wow. They were absolutely incredible. And they've been playing together for years.
Yeah. Yeah. What a fascinating, like, that's such a foreign world to me, just in terms of the strings and those ornamentations and the quartertones.
Yeah.
How on earth did you get acclimated to like that language? Because you were doing, I mean, even though they altered your arrangements, you had to have been kind of living in that Middle Eastern tone world. Like how'd you get into that?
I was working with a guy called Abdullah Shahade, who's a master musician from Syria. Uh-huh. And so the whole idea with the Syriana project, it was marrying the West and the Eastern traditions. Mm-hmm. So that's why, as a Western arranger, I was very aware of the things that were going on. Yeah. You have to arrange in a fairly broad way and then leave room for maneuvering. Okay. So for example, there wasn't, I actually asked them to do a lot of things which a Western orchestra wouldn't think twice about, like spiccato and various types of bowing. And they weren't au fait with this. So it brought them outside of their comfort zone in some way. So we were both dealing with lack of comfort zone. Okay. Yeah. And a lot of concepts that we would have, as string arrangers for coloration and bow direction and just general tools of the trade. They didn't use those. They used other things. So when I asked them to do specific things, to harmonize in intervals which they may not actually have wanted to or would have normally done, they were actually quite excited about it. They were hugely, hugely open. They'd all studied both in the Western tradition through Russian masters who taught in the academy there, and they'd studied with a sheikh. They'd studied the maqam. They'd studied the old-fashioned scales, 27 different types of quartertone scales.
Whoa, 27. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Check that out. You know, when you've got a bad day, dealing with a couple of minor scales with one of your students, check out 27 quartertone variations.
What are you doing as a bass player? Because you're playing. I mean, how are you playing in quartertones too, or are you? How does life as a bass player work in that kind of a world?
Well, as a bass player, up until, I mean, I sort of studied what was going on in the orchestras. An awful lot of the orchestras, the bass was providing a very, very basic harmonic structure. Mm-hmm. I got into playing a lot of harmonies and a lot of secondary lines. So yeah, I did actually have to learn quartertone structures, and I was using a small chamber bass, which made it a lot easier. Yeah. You know, with a smaller scale, because the problem you face when you try to play quartertones in a full-size orchestral bass is a quartertone, by the nature of it, is as important as any intonation. And I was finding it quite difficult to get the quartertones to work because I was so used to the normal 42-inch scale. Mm-hmm. So I went to, I'd actually bought a small chamber bass, a Tononi copy made by an Australian maker, and it proved to be a lot easier. I started originally on cello, so it was like halfway house between cello and bass.
Oh, okay.
So it's very interesting because if you talk to anyone who sort of works in the early music scene, very often they will say that a lot of the original arrangements which used the non-tempered scale had actually got quartertone implications in them. For example, the way we actually flatten the seventh coming down now. We take that for granted, especially as jazz players. Yeah. But the idea of a flattened second going up, very often in Arabic music, the flattened second is actually a quartertone higher. But it is the second degree of the scale, but it's just that it's only a quartertone as opposed to a tone or a semitone.
Oh, interesting.
You have to bend your ear around a bit, and I think it's probably easier for bass players sometimes because we tend to see the bigger harmonic picture.
Yeah, sure.
So within an orchestral context, we see the harmonic structure of the piece far more readily than a lot of the high melody players. And we also see the form of the music as it modulates or transposes. Yeah. So I don't think it was as much of a bind for me as it might have been for other players. Having said that, we did an amazing concert with the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, who actually played the album live.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And I gave them the parts that I'd used in the Middle East. And those string players, they're led by Thelma Handy. I mean, they're way, way more advanced because they do a huge amount of contemporary music as well, for prepared instruments and with specific needs with regard to altered intonation. Yeah. They really got it spot on. Yeah. So I think most orchestral players are excited by the idea, if they're into the idea of experimentation and into 20th century and 21st century music. I think they're probably able to facilitate this once they get the overall intonation structure.
Yeah. No, it's such an exciting harmonic language if you're not used to it. I love what you mentioned, how bass players tend to see the bigger harmonic picture. I've thought about that a lot, because we're playing those roots and moving through the structure. And if we're playing orchestra, we're sitting in the back kind of watching the whole thing. And I've always wondered, is that why? Because it just seems like a lot of bassists go into arranging or conducting or compose, like maybe a little more than the first violinist who's so consumed with the melody.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it is for all those reasons. One of the interesting things that happened to me latterly when I lived in London was I was asked to do some conducting, and I was the main bass player in the chamber orchestra, and the orchestral the conductor had to go back to Vietnam to do some work, and I was greatly honored to be asked to conduct. But what I found very interesting was when I asked him why he chose me as opposed to one of the main viola players who was his main arranger, he said, "You guys keep better time."
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, there has been a huge amount of discussion. I would concur with a lot of the sentiment at the moment, which says that a lot of conductors don't understand the role of double bass in orchestra, and don't understand the way which we produce our tone, and don't understand the fact that where we're actually standing within the orchestra, we're sort of a bit isolated, and at the same time, the orchestra feels us before they hear us.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think you have to look at the musicality of the group, and if you've got four bass players working together, the fact of the matter is those guys are pretty well going to sing from the same hymn sheet, and very often the conductor is not the best person to actually analyze what's coming from his right-hand side. He's not actually hearing that. You know, he's got some preconceived idea of what the bass should actually sound like.
That's fascinating, because I totally feel that, depending on the conductor you're working with. How have you seen people misunderstand the bass sound from the podium? Is it like they think it's too loud, they think it's too early, too late, the tone's too strident? Like what are some of the common? I think
one of the big problems that we have is that very often the bass section is the section which plays together least often. Mm-hmm. You know, especially in chamber music, we're down to one bass or maybe two, and then when it goes up to three or four, we've got a problem. On the bigger orchestras, the basses tend to be a little bit more together, and maybe they're a bit too together and they're a bit too set in their ways. I think one of the main problems you have standing on the podium is that you hear an awful lot of cello coming from your right-hand side, and what you actually audibly hear from the basses is a harmonic octave above what they're actually playing.
Yeah, right.
And depending on the hall, and depending on the surface that you're playing on, and depending on a lot of things, the bass it's a very, very particular instrument. And the advances in string manufacturing the past couple of years are amazing. I mean, I've got four basses here, all strung with different orchestral strings. And I would actually hazard to say that the ones with the gut strings, I would be least likely to bring out on the gig, and the ones with the man-made gut are probably the best in terms of general intonation and leading the note on the nose, and and the articulation, and there's an awful lot of lazy bass players,
sure,
Jason.
Sure.
There are a huge number of lazy bass players. But I think at the same time, it's, the scale of the instrument and what we're expected to do. I think bass playing standards have come leaps and bounds in the past 30 years.
No, for sure. I've done a fair amount of conducting in my life. And as soon as I started doing that, it was amazing how much it changed what I thought about bass sections, and like hearing a bass section from there, and like what I was so used to experiencing, like sitting in the section with the other bass players and then hearing it from 30 feet away from the podium with the bass. I mean, it was really eye-opening, and that changed how I play in the section for sure.
Mm-hmm. Equally, I think an awful lot of work which we're required to play in the orchestral canon is 18th and 19th century editions of works which weren't necessarily arranged that way at the time. And I think it's very telling when you look at the type of orchestral arrangements which were, the hangover from the midpoint of the 20th century, when an awful lot of music became a lot cheaper to print. You get an awful lot of not particularly well edited bass parts. I think because of the casual nature of the bass sections, I don't think we were actually afforded an awful lot of time in terms of sufficient arrangement, and it just was too easy to copy the cello line across to the bass. As a result, there was a lot of sloppy playing because it was just physically impossible often to play that section in a tight formation, and you got an awful lot of rubbish bass playing as a result. I think an awful lot more modern composers are very, very clued into the effectiveness of a well-written bass part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're not seeing those straight up cello transcriptions anymore.
No. And I think that's something which is being reviewed as orchestral recordings are becoming more and more sought after in terms of trying to get original instruments or original arrangements or better recordings, and recording techniques are better, and you've got people who are actually working behind the desk who understand how to mic up a bass or mic up a bass section. I think you're getting a lot more clarity in what's going on in the bottom end. Mm-hmm. You listen to some of the recordings, done in the 30s and 40s, and it's quite shocking actually how bad the stuff the bottom end is, And then you get into the heyday of the 50s and 60s with in situ recording studios for orchestras for the very first time, and you get a glaring difference between what was going on with the Cleveland and what was going on with the LSO and what was going on with the Metropolitan Opera House in New York and what was going on in Covent Garden. Huge differences in color and everything else. And then, of course, you get the German orchestras that said, okay, we're all going to go with the one bass maker. We'll all get Pullman basses.
Right.
And carry around these huge wardrobes that sound like wardrobes, and, and sort of the Berlin Philharmonic, had this thundering great sound, but there's no intonation. You can't tune those damn things. They're impossible.
How would you mic up a bass section these days? Like, are you putting, because I played a fair amount of orchestral recording sessions and I see different methods and different, what's advanced, or like, what would you do if you're going to mic up an orchestra? Someone said to me once, it was a technician who worked for the BBC. The main BBC radio orchestra is based in London, and they're a very versatile band. They've got some great bass players. Richard Watson's just retired as their principal bass player, but he said to me, depending on what we're actually doing, he said, very often I'll put a stereo pair behind the conductor's head. I'll put all the microphones up, but the only microphones picking anything up are the ones behind the conductor's head. Oh, sure. That makes sense. Yeah. Right.
And I mean, I've been on sessions where there's a forest of microphones, and I just know, yeah, you go. I've seen amazing technique used at Abbey Road and places like that, and in Air Studios. But you actually have to remember that the bottom line is it's going to come out in 16-bit on a CD, and it's going to come out in stereo. And if they get it wrong on the day, the phasing that's going to go on in the bass section is just going to be nonsense. So I think less is more. And it largely depends. It largely depends on the instruments. I mean, I've sat in bass sections and I've thought to myself, because we don't have standardized instruments, that's always been the big problem with double basses. You've got, you put together, 50 bass players in a room, you're going to have 50 different makes of basses and 50 different styles of strings, setups, bridges, the whole 9 yards. We're a very individual bunch, and that actually works in our favor. unlike fiddle players who tend to sort of herd together like sheep.
That's true.
I'm going to get shot by some fiddle.
It's okay. We're a pretty safe zone here. I don't think we have a lot of those folks tuning in. A few, but how did you get into arranging? When did that happen?
It's very interesting. My great grandfather was an arranger. He actually was a major in the British Army. He was a band major in the British Army, and I was 18 or 19 and just sort of taking music studies seriously. And my dad found a whole load of his grandfather's arrangements. And I pored over these arrangements. You know, they were fantastic arrangements of all manner of things. But it sort of unlocked something within me. And at the time I was taking lessons in counterpoint from a great professor, Dr. Joseph Gruco, who wrote the definitive ending to the Art of Fugue for Novello. I showed him the arrangements, and he sat down with me at that lesson, and we just went through the arrangement, and he showed me, he basically got into my great-grandfather's head, and he showed me how my great-grandfather's harmonic sequence worked. And he said, we all have this harmonic sequence. So it's all different. So that's why different arrangers work in different ways. And for 2 years, while we were supposed to be doing mainly Bach, we did arranging. We did all manner of arranging. He would sit down at the piano and work, and he would play me, you know, maybe part of the Elgar Enigma variations. And he'd show me where things worked in a very, very hands-on 4 or 5 part way. 4 weeks before my main exam, he sort of said to me, we better do some Bach now or else you're going to fail this. But he gave me a huge amount of background on voicings. And then when I moved to London, I met various people who had worked in the music industry as arrangers in the heyday of the 60s and 70s, when they did a huge amount of live TV with big bands and orchestras. And these guys were just hanging around. You know, they were mainly retired. And I went and spoke to them, and I'd ring them up, Kenny Clayton and people like that. And they'd be more than happy for you to go around and hang out. It's interesting. It's only in the last couple of years I've realized that there was a whole load of us came out of Dublin, guys like Dave O'Rourke. David O'Rourke is now up in New York and has been for 25 years, but he's an amazing arranger, fantastic string arranger. He works a lot with he's currently working with Christine Tobin and various people up there, Carleen Anderson. I mean, just incredible that a whole lot of us came out at the same time and latterly have sort of come forward as arrangers. And I remember talking to Gary Carpenter, who's he's very well known British contemporary composer. And I said to him, I'm thinking of having some lessons in string arranging. And he said, what's there to get lessons about? Just do it. Basically is how I got into it. I think if you are curious as a musician and you have got good people around you, I think arranging comes easier, and it's certainly not out of a book, because I've got a whole shelf of books here which are very well-meaning but are gobbledygook. And I've got my great-grandfather's book, but I've got the book he studied from, which was written something like 1875. It's a fantastic piece of information, but you actually read it now and you realize it's so of the time. It's talking about 3-string basses. It's talking about clarinets that only go up as far as the C above middle C. I mean, it's of its era. But I've always found the easiest way to deal with arranging is to try and sit down the piano and work it out.
Okay.
That's why I've never been one of these people who could sort of use Sibelius or Finale or something like that. It just didn't work.
Well, it's such a different experience sitting there at the piano and feeling that versus like sitting at the computer and.
Yeah. And of course, one of my composition teachers, Brian Beckett, said to me, be very wary about composing at the piano because you'll limit yourself to as far as you can go with your piano technique, which is completely true. Mm-hmm. But on something like string arranging, I sort of get it in my head and then I work it out. I do a huge, because I still play the cello. In fact, a friend of mine, Paul Downing, who's a great bass player, London bass player, told me that D'Addario had made cello strings to tune a cello like a bass.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, in fourths.
Okay.
And they really work. My God, it has made my life so much easier.
I'm sure.
For here, I get the Neumann mic, I fire up the Tegler preamp, and I've now got to the point with a lot of remixes where I can put 5-6 cello lines down, and yeah, it's sort of in the ballpark.
So are you playing an EADG strung up cello right now? Is that?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, that's great.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to be quite honest, it's quite satisfying because the way cellists figure out the whole thing is it's a completely different mentality to the way bass players work. Fourths is a completely different medium. It's a different discipline.
I play some cello myself. Especially when I would conduct. I did a lot of youth orchestra conducting, and I'm such a bad violinist that I'm essentially useless up there. I grab a violin, and it's better to just have someone else play it. But cello I can kind of play. And I would go through phases where I would practice a lot of cello, and I really felt like it changed just the way I approach the bass. Does cello, how has that affected your bass playing? Like keeping that skill up?
Well, I would say that the bowing technique I learned because I went to the academy as a cellist. I didn't play the bass until I was 26.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So the cello playing, my bowing in particular, was very advanced, and it meant that when I then went onto the bass, I'd sorted out an awful lot of problems with the right hand that a lot of bass players take far too long to deal with. Mm-hmm. And it changed the way I teach. I was very, very much of the opinion that as soon as you put a bow in a kid's hand, you need to get the bowing absolutely right before anyone goes anywhere near the left hand. And I hope that my students would concur that it sort of worked, but they're doing okay. So it obviously I haven't damaged them too badly. But it was Joan Dixon, my teacher, basically said, if you get the bowing fluent, with good muscle, good muscle flow and everything else, you don't actually need to do bucket loads of technique. And I agree completely with it. Because I knew of teachers and the students would go in and my God, they were doing Shevchik till it came out their ears. And they weren't learning anything. Their tone production was rubbish. Their inflection, their ability to accent and things, it wasn't any better. So I think that aspect of my playing improved my double bass playing. I think one thing which I promised myself when I went from cello to bass was I was going to make sure I could improvise on the bass before I actually read a note off the page.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because I was hugely frustrated as an improviser on the cello because I'd learned as a classical musician.
That kind of boxed you off.
I think it does. Hugely. Yeah. And it's interesting because now I teach improvising at Laurie Blake's International Cello School down in Castres here, which is just very close. And we get amazing students coming from all over the world to spend a week with her, improving their cello technique. They're mainly professional cellists. And she says, right, you're going to spend the morning with Bernard, and you can just see the blood drain from their faces. These amazing players become all shaky and wobbly. And at the end of the morning or the end of the afternoon session, they're going, my brain hurts. And I said, well, that's because you're thinking of things in a completely different way.
How do you start? Because that's such a hard thing for classical string players to get to wrap their brain around, right? Like I've gone to these conventions here in the States, and it's like trying to loosen up string players to just, how do you take, let's just take somebody who already has chops. They already can play as a classical player.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even start teaching improv with them?
I limit them to one or two notes.
Okay.
And use rhythm, because one of the biggest issues that most bowed string players have is rhythm.
Yeah.
They're stiff.
Yeah.
And we get sort of question and answer type rhythm things going on, and limit them to very, very few notes. Mm-hmm. And from that, then they have to think, I'm only using these 3 notes, but I have to use this rhythm. And he's just played this rhythm to me, so I've actually to copy that back using the 3 notes, but making it sound even better. So I think it's a case of actually getting away from the page, because they've become so caught up in that's an E on the, the third space of the bass clef, so I have to put a first finger on the D string. No, not necessarily so.
There's something about the printed page that just like taps into a certain part of our brain. That's just like a different part of the brain.
It's a conditioning. And I think a lot of classical players of all instruments use the page as a comfort zone, because they spend a huge amount of time. I mean, you have to look at the amount of time invested by any classical player in technique, in sight reading, in learning orchestral excerpts, in preparing for auditions. They're investing a huge amount in prepared material, and they get into a situation where that becomes their meat and potatoes. They're solid on that. You ask them to play, in a Beethoven symphony, they know exactly where they are. They know exactly what they're doing. You do the Mozart Requiem, they'll know exactly what's going on. That's a lot of investment in time and effort and expertise. And they've actually done that in order to pinpoint an excellence. You take that away from them, and they don't have any safety net, and they just go into la la land.
Yeah, it's like panic mode. They're like playing with as much vibrato as possible.
I know. Yeah. They forget about it as music. It's music, So effectively, I think the key is to give achievable results early on, and to do it in a group fun way, and to reinforce the fact that there's a pulse in improvised music, because a lot of classical players think that improvised music is without pulse.
Mm-hmm. So you get this aleatoric sort of...
Yeah, it's all over the place. No, it's actually probably more stylized than the Bach solo suites. So just get that into your head, start with. So there's a lot of that goes on, Jason. Huge amount of that, a misunderstanding. And once you actually explain the idea that, harmonic sequence and scales and modes and that type of thing, and that they see that that there are boundaries and that there are specific expectations from the listener and from the other people in your ensemble, then they begin to get it.
For me, like the bow, just the bow itself is kind of like a monkey wrench, because it's like the up bow, down bow, slurred, non-slurred, like it just sort of like messes up like just that. It's just like a hard thing to wrap my head around when I try to teach improv. Like when you're on those early experiences, are you having people just play separate bows or slurs, or like what do you do with the bow for?
Right. Well, okay. So one of the things which I always said as a teacher, when my students would come in with a piece of music to prepare, I would say, can you play this piece all separate bows? Mm-hmm. And the reason I said that was because a lot of my teachers said slurring is something which sort of came in the Romantic era and is a bit of a hangover. Certainly, I think slurring on the bass, you lose a huge amount of individuality of tone by slurring unnecessarily on the bass. And a lot of my students would say, but you haven't put any bowing. I said, because I want you to learn the piece of music and then bow it as it comes. And then if we've got a problem here or a problem here, then we'll put in a mandatory bowing for that section. But a huge amount of bass pieces, as you know, a lot of the stuff we started off on were transcriptions of violin pieces. And it's only when you actually get a piece of music that's written for bass specifically, which has been well edited by the composer, or he's got someone who actually knows how to edit for bass. And then you actually see purposeful slurring going on. Not something that's supposed to be for a violin or a viola or a cello. Something that's purposeful for the bass. So the same with improvising. Say, if you want to use all separate bows, use all separate bows. You're going to actually be probably more likely to play in better time with better pulse. Less is more.
Like, what's a week in the life look like for you, if there is a week in the life? Like, do you write in the mornings? You kind of write whenever you have time? Or how does that work for you?
Now that I'm sort of down here, I've got a lot more time. So I tend to... I'll set out a particular project. Like, I'm doing a project at the moment with an Irish composer called Brendan Ring, who plays uilleann pipes and Irish harp. So we're doing an album. We've recorded most of it here. In fact, we record all of it here. And I will basically sit at the piano and sort of just tease out something for a couple of hours and then leave it alone, then go down the garden. So I've got no hard and fast regime. I tend to write when I need to write. And I tend to write best at night. So I will sort of, if, for example, I'm doing this remix for Real World at the moment, it's for the Syriana project. So I've had to write taking a piece of Greek music in 7/8 time, but I'm not using any of the original melody. I've taken sort of like a chord sequence and I've decided then to write along with that. So because I studied serialism in a big way, I tend to write things very much in logical blocks. And one of my co-writers, Paul Downing, we do a lot of serial stuff still, but we do it with a certain amount of technology at our fingertips. So, for example, one of the last projects we did, we wrote down things on paper, back to pen and paper, write out something on paper. And as soon as I've got it on paper and I see a form and I see a concept, then I can actually work. I then sort of back engineer the melody and I sort of retrograde it and do lots of things like that. So it's old school. It's sort of the same way that a lot of serial composers have worked. But I find that actually works with my more melodic stuff as well. Yeah. So, and I guess I'm 55 now. I've been composing for over 35 years. You get to know when you haven't used enough of the material to its full extent. And I think a lot of young composers, they throw away ideas after one usage. They don't develop things. And I think maybe I've begun to realize that if you actually get a good idea and then work it.
Bernard, thank you so much for chatting. So great to talk with you for the podcast. And folks, that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. I hope you've been having fun here in 2017, following along with these new episodes of so much great content in store. I don't even know where to begin. Check out everything we've got going on at contrabassconversations.com. And if you enjoy these episodes, share them with a friend. I guarantee you've got some people in your life that haven't even heard of the podcast. Even though we've got a big reach, it's amazing how many people still have never heard one of these. So take this episode and share it with a friend. That would be so great. I'd really appreciate it. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.